or just two. All right, so be aware of these things, and that's what this whole section is about, is possible threats to biodiversity. All right, now I'm gonna go through each one of these in the next slides, and I go through them in detail in the other lecture that I'll actually post in Canvas. It actually has little drawings, little notes, and stuff like that that might help you understand it. So be prepared for that. All right, now habitat loss, that's the first reason. The number one threat to biodiversity on this planet is habitat loss, and the number one cause of loss of species is humans, right? And we are the reason that organisms on this planet are going extinct. I think I read somewhere one time that over 99% of the species that have ever lived on this planet are extinct. So everything that is here, which includes bacteria, plants, animals, all of that stuff, is only 1% of everything that has ever lived on this planet. And that's kind of hard, that's kind of wild, right? It's wild to imagine that, but that's the fact of the matter. All right, now what is it that humans are doing? Things like deforestation, right? Urbanization, all of the coal burning power plants that we have that are burning coal is releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's causing global warming. That's causing global water temperatures to rise. And that's affecting all the coral reefs out in the ocean, like those pretty pictures of coral reefs and stuff like that. You know, every animal has a range of tolerance, and that water is just too warm for those coral to survive. So it's causing those species numbers to decline. And it's leading again to the threatened, endangered, or extinction of those species. And it's sometimes just clearing land for agriculture. We're destroying the homes, the places these organisms live. So when we do that, that is a threat to biodiversity. Habitat fragmentation, you'll learn when you watch the lecture that is the separation of one wilderness area from another. That can be because of the building of roads, the building of farmland, and it also leads to the extinction of local species. This is kind of what habitat fragmentation looks like. You know, at one point in time, this was a big wilderness area. It was nothing but trees, and it was habitat for animals. But now you have the introduction of this farmland, all of these roads, right? It's the patchwork that you can see on the planet, like if you're flying in an airplane. But anyway, this whole big wilderness area, now you see it's cut into smaller, right? Smaller little wilderness areas. And usually these animals won't migrate back and forth between the two. And if you separate a predator from prey, then you could have a big problem, right? The prey population would explode, and the predator population, since they don't have any food anymore, their numbers would just decline, right? Because they're going to be in competition for what little food they can find. And then some of them might even starve or have to leave the environment altogether. So that's habitat fragmentation versus habitat loss. Edge effect is something you might hear about on the EOC. I'm not sure. Edge effect is basically where land meets ocean, or where land meets a tree line. Is basically when you have two ecosystems that come together, and there's a special set of conditions along that edge called edge effect. Sometimes you'll bring different species together when these ecosystems meet, and you could bring potential predators into contact with prey. And if you do that, then you know, you could have a loss of species, right? Because we are talking about threats to biodiversity. All right. Edge effect would be like, you know, you bring animals together along the edge of this forest. Naturally, curiosity brings animals towards the edge of the forest, like deer, for example. Sometimes when hunters hunt deer, they will hunt them along the edge of a tree line. They wait for them to come out of the woods looking for food, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, that would lead to a decrease in the deer population in that environment. So that is another threat to biodiversity. All right, just reminding you of the things here. Now, on a different topic, right now, the first three, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and edge effect, is how we're affecting habitats, right? Or when habitats come together, like with edge effect. Habitat degradation is more or less how we're polluting the environments and how that can lead to a loss of biodiversity. All right. There are three types of habitat degradation. There's air pollution, which you see right here, water pollution, and land pollution. Okay. Now, air pollution comes from any of those coal burning power plants, like you see right here. And when they burn that gas when they burn that coal, they will release chemicals out into the atmosphere. And these chemicals will actually contain two components you need to be familiar with. One is carbon dioxide, and the other one is sulfur dioxide. Carbon dioxide causes global warming because it's a greenhouse gas, overall global climate change, increase of earth temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. That's carbon dioxide. Sulfur dioxide, which is also released in this, causes acid precipitation. Please make sure you don't get those two mixed up. Sulfur dioxide is acid rain, carbon dioxide, global warming, okay? Acid precipitation can affect lake and pond ecosystems when all that water runs down. It'll lower the pH in the water. And sometimes, you know, fish have a range of tolerance. They can withstand certain fluctuations in the pH of the water. But if it gets too acidic, it'll kill those fish, all right? Same thing with some trees. I do know that it can destroy trees and vegetation, acid rain. And if any animals depend on that vegetation or trees for habitat or food, then if you destroy those trees, you're going to end up affecting those organisms that depend on it. And that again could be a threat to biodiversity in that area. Now, this is a little bit separate topic. Y'all ever seen aerosol cans before, like spray paint cans and hairspray cans and stuff like that? A lot of those cans used to contain a chemical called chlorofluorocarbons, or also known as CFCs. So it used to be in aerosol cans. And scientists found out that it actually destroys the ozone layer, which is an outer layer that protects us from sun's UV rays or ultraviolet radiation. Well, UV rays, that can cause skin cancer. That's why you put on sunscreen and stuff like that to prevent those UV rays from attacking your skin and causing you to have skin cancer. Well, when scientists found out that these things were destroying the ozone layer, which protects us from these UV rays and keeps us from getting skin cancer, right? They actually banned these chemicals from all aerosol sprays. So now if you actually look on the back of most cans of aerosols, or most aerosol cans, you'll see a sign that says, or a little symbol that says contains no CFCs, right? And that's because these things will deplete or degrade the ozone layer. They break the ozone layer down. And we kind of need the ozone layer, right? Because I read a stat one time that said if we did not have an ozone layer, most people would die from skin cancer around the age of 30. Right? So it's a big deal, right? So you got air pollution, CO2s and SO2s, that's obviously air pollution because they're released into the air. Chlorofluorocarbons, when you spray that can, you're spraying it out into the air, and those CFCs are destroying the ozone layer, which is in the air, so therefore it is air pollution. Don't be an idiot and put that the release of CFCs is related to land pollution. You don't. Excuse me, I almost said something bad. Don't mix those things up if you don't mind. Now, water pollution is when you have any type of excess use of fertilizer or animal waste and it runs off into some type of water, like a stream, a lake, a pond, a river, anything of that nature. And what happens is farmers will put out too much fertilizer, or if there's an animal farm, a hog farm or a cow farm or whatever, a lot of that animal waste will get washed down to the lowest point, which could be a lake, river, stream, or a pond. And since all of these things are full of nitrogen, they're basically like a plant fertilizer. And y'all have probably seen algae growing on the top of a pond before. It's like that green substance that grows on the top of water. It's literally a plant. And if you wash down a bunch of fertilizer to those plants, it's going to bloom and it'll cover the entire surface of that water, right? And y'all might have seen that before. And when that happens, sunlight cannot penetrate, cannot get down in that water. And there's plants and stuff that's in that water that depends on that sunlight. And those plants do photosynthesis. And photosynthesis produces oxygen. And all of the little bubbles of oxygen that's in that water are needed by fish and other organisms that live in that water. So without sunlight, the plants in the water can't do photosynthesis. Without photosynthesis occurring in the plants in the water's not going to have oxygen. And without the oxygen in the water, the fish can't survive, right? So if you have this algal bloom and it covers the top of the water, that means you can't get any sunlight. That means these plants can't do photosynthesis. And that means that oxygen is not going to be available for animals. And all of those fish would basically die. So that is, again, another threat to biodiversity, right? It could cause the plant population to die. It could cause the fish population to die. And then any organism in that environment that depends on those fish, just say it was a bear, right? A grizzly bear fishing for salmon, okay? That grizzly bear population could drop because their food source has been affected. All right, keep that in mind. That's water pollution. And then y'all know water pollution, there's the Clean Water Act and things like that. People can't just dump waste into the water or into the environment, into any river, because that could cause a major problem long term. All right, now land pollution. Land pollution is like your garbage in landfills. You can't put too much waste in the soil. And then also farmers have to be careful about the overuse of pesticides and fertilizers, because if they use too much of it, those nutrients get stuck in the soil, right? And then that pesticide can be absorbed by a plant. And then that pesticide can be absorbed by anything that eats that plant, right? And then that pesticide can be absorbed even more as you move up that pyramid of energy. There is a theory, and it is in I'm telling you, you need to go back and watch the lecture from this morning sometime. There is a theory called bioaccumulation or biological magnification. And the theory says that as any fertilizer or pesticide or herbicide or whatever moves up that pyramid of energy, the concentration of that pesticide or herbicide or whatever will actually magnify or accumulate. It gets greater as you move up that pyramid. And we're at the top of the pyramid. Humans are at the top of the pyramid. Large organisms are at the top of that pyramid. And it can have a major impact on organisms. It can actually kill organisms as that pesticide becomes more and more concentrated as it moves up. And I explained that a little bit better in the first period lecture that I want y'all to go back and watch. And there'll be some questions on it in the future that you need to be aware of. But that is a very dangerous situation, so you have to be careful about that. That's why people like to eat a lot of organic food, because these foods don't have any chemicals or pesticides or herbicides or hormones that have been injected into them, because they want to keep those kind of things out of their body. Matter of fact, you're not even supposed to eat fish out of the Lumber River because of pollution in the Lumber River that has accumulated in those fish. They say that the mercury content is very high. How that happens, I don't know, but you're not advised to eat fish out of the Lumber River. Now, do people still do it? Yeah. Is everybody in the world brilliant? No. So you see why people still eat fish out of the Lumber River, because they're not brilliant. It's just, sorry if that offended anybody, but it is what it is. Now, exotic species. These are things that can cause a threat to biodiversity. In an area, just say you had a new species introduced that is not naturally living there, right? It's not native to that environment. It will become an invasive species or an exotic species or a non-native species, right? Non-native or exotic or invasive species are species that are not normally found in an environment. And when they're not normally found in that environment, they have no natural predators, right? And they will grow exponentially due to the fact that they have no predators. And when they grow exponentially, they're going to use up all the native species resources, and it will cause a decline in the native species. So it would actually kind of look like this. I'll draw this really quickly for you. If you had your native species and it had reached its carrying capacity, and you introduced a non-native species, it would grow exponentially. But since it's using all of the native species resources and all of the native species space and food and water and shelter, it's going to cause the native species to decline, right? And that decline would be a loss of biodiversity. Now, two organisms that I've seen pop up on the EOC that this is related to is something called a lionfish. A lionfish is actually native to, and there's Florida, Texas, and California. Okay, that's a perfect representation of the United States of America. A lionfish is actually native to the Pacific Ocean. There's none in the Atlantic Ocean. But people have had lionfish in their saltwater aquariums, and they've had them in Florida and other places along the East Coast. And rather than to kill the fish, people think they're going to do something nice, and they're going to release it back into the wild. They're going to free will it, right? So they dump them in the Atlantic Ocean, and they're like, oh man, I've done a great thing. Well, lionfish are non-native to the Atlantic Ocean. And when you release them, they will grow exponentially. And they have actually caused all of the native species in the Atlantic Ocean, their population sizes have declined. So people are actually being paid money to go out and hunt lionfish because they're using up all the native species resources, and they're causing our natural species in the Atlantic Ocean to actually plummet. All right, so be careful when you release things back into the wild. If you're going to release them back into the wild, put them in their natural habitat. Like, for example, I mean, you know, just to put things in perspective, if people were capturing and releasing lions or Bengal tigers and allowing them to reproduce, you wouldn't want to come out here in St. Paul's and release them in St. Paul's, right? They wouldn't have any natural predators here. They would grow exponentially, and we would eventually run into a problem. All right. Now, one I know y'all have seen, this vine that you see growing here is called a kudzu vine, right? It is called a kudzu, right? And you can see it's growing exponentially. It's growing out of control, right? It is growing out of control. And any native plants or native vegetation that might have been in this area, I don't know, like a dogwood tree or a shrub or I don't know, whatever, obviously it's being outcompeted for space, for sunlight, for water, for food, for nutrients. So all of these native plant vegetations are going down, right? So that whatever that native plant was, their species is declining. Same thing here. You can see how this kudzu just takes over this entire area. Well, anything that depended on that plant in that food chain, what do you think is going to happen to their numbers? Their numbers are going to decline, right? Because they're not just going to decide, oh, well, I'll eat kudzu now. That's not what they do. And the reason this kudzu is growing exponentially is because it doesn't have anything that naturally eats it. So this can cause major problems. I think this was actually introduced into North Carolina as like an ornamental plant. Like y'all may have seen buildings before where people will put vines growing on the side of them just because it looks nostalgic, or, you know, just it adds character to a building to have vines growing up the wall or some crap like that. But what they didn't realize is there was nothing in this area that naturally preys or eats this vine. So it has caused a tremendous problem being an invasive or an exotic or a non-native species in our area. All right, so you had quite a few threats to biodiversity here today. You had habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, edge effect, habitat degradation, and the exotic species introduction. Now again, remember, exotic species, non-native species, invasive species, they all mean the same thing.